hit the wall so hard the picture frames rattled, and for a second I thought the wood might crack with my skull. My stepfather, Roy, had both hands on my wrists, fingers digging into my skin as he shoved a pen toward the papers on the dining table. "Sign it, Mila. This land is mine. Your mother owed me everything." His breath smelled like cheap whiskey and old anger, the same mix that had followed me through this house in Cottage Grove, Wisconsin, since I was a kid. Outside, it was almost midnight in April, the fields frozen and quiet, but in our small kitchen, the air felt hot and thin. The light over the table burned on a single page: quitclaim deed, transfer of interest. If I signed, I gave up my rights to the 3.7 acres my mother called legacy lot land, an appraiser had valued at $820,000. I knew that number because I pulled it myself. By day, I work as a real estate appraisal assistant at Dane County Property Analytics. I live in spreadsheets and parcel maps, watching other people build wealth on paper while I rent a small apartment and drive an old Honda. To Roy, I am still just the girl who came attached to my mother's ring the burden he never asked for. Tonight, he jerked me closer until my back hit the wall again and the doorknob pressed into my spine. "You are 29 with nothing," he hissed. "People like you do not know what to do with property. You would waste it. I am the one who took care of your mother. I am the one who deserves this land." The old instinct rose up in me, the one that says, keep your head down and apologize, do anything to keep him from getting louder. My mother had spent years walking on eggshells around his temper. Do not start anything, she would whisper. It is easier if you let it go. 3 weeks before she died, she held my hand in her hospital bed and said something different. "Promise me, you will not let anyone push you out of what is yours." I had no idea she meant him. "I am not signing," I said, barely louder than a breath. Roy laughed sharp and humorless and squeezed until my fingers tingled. "You think you have a choice." He yanked my arm so hard my shoulder slammed into the wall. Above us, a small wooden box tipped off the shelf and fell, hitting the floor with a thud. The lid popped open. A brass key slid out, and a narrow yellow envelope skidded across the wood. In the glare of the kitchen light, I saw my mother's handwriting on the envelope. "Mila, if Roy ever hurts you, open this." My stomach flipped. For a second, Roy followed my gaze. Then he kicked the box aside with his boot, sending it into the baseboard. "Do not touch that junk. Your mother kept everything. She did not understand money. You think she left you some secret in there? She did not leave you anything. Everything she had, she owed me." He leaned close until I could see the red veins in his eyes. "I will take the land and you will get nothing. Do you understand nothing?" Between us, the deed waited on the table, my name printed under the line that would hand over the property. Roy had done his homework or hired someone who had. For a long time, I believed that gave him all the power. Tonight, I noticed something else. On the floor beside my shoe, the brass key caught the light. Along its side was a tiny stamped symbol, almost invisible if you did not know what you were seeing. The stylized outline of a logo I look at every week on confidential reports. It belonged to a private land trust that only a few appraisers and attorneys in the Midwest ever deal with. My mother had never worked in real estate. She should not have had a key from them. My pulse slowed. Not because I felt safe, but because a crack had opened in the story Roy had been forcing on me since the funeral. He thinks I am still the girl who hid in the basement when he raised his voice, the one who thought legal forms were just paper. He has no idea what I do now or what numbers I see. "You are wrong," I said quietly. "Very wrong." His grip tightened, then faltered. "What did you say?" I pulled one wrist free and held my arm close to my chest, skin throbbing where his fingers had dug in. "I am not signing anything tonight. And if you put your hands on me again, we can talk about it with a judge listening." His jaw clenched. He called me ungrateful and useless and a burden, the same old words he had thrown at me for years. They still stung, but they did not land the way they used to. While he paced and muttered, I let my shoulders slump and my eyes drop, playing the part he expected. Inside, my mind had already moved on. There was a key with a symbol I recognized. There was an envelope with my name on it in my mother's careful script. There were records in county systems he did not even know existed, and doors I had quiet access to because of the boring job he liked to mock. When he finally grabbed his jacket and stomped out to his truck, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, he thought he had scared me into a corner. I stood in the empty kitchen listening to his engine fade down the gravel driveway. Then I turned the deadbolt bent to pick up the brass key and the yellow envelope and whispered into the quiet, "You just made the worst mistake of your life, Roy. And you are not the only one who knows what this land is really worth anymore." I remember growing up in that same house in Cottage Grove with the feeling that every breath I took was borrowed time. A quiet apology to a man who never wanted me there. And long before Roy shoved me against a wall demanding my signature, he had been planting the seed that I was nothing more than an inconvenience he had been forced to accept, because from the moment he moved in when I was 9, he made sure I understood exactly where I belonged in his world, which was nowhere near the center of it, and I can still hear the first time he called me a burden, as easily as someone might comment on the weather, the word rolling off his tongue with practiced ease, as though he had been waiting for the chance to say it, leaning back in his chair at the old pine kitchen table while my mother served him dinner, his eyes never meeting hers, his tone sharp in a way that forced her shoulders to tighten even when she tried to smile. And I remember the way her voice trembled when she said Roy. She's only a child, yet he never stopped repeating it so often and so casually that by the time I reached high school, I half believed him, because children absorb cruelty like rainwater and turn it inward, letting it soak into the cracks they do not know they have. Roy controlled the house like he controlled his words, heavy and unapologetic, and any moment of peace existed only in the thin spaces between his moods, which changed as quickly as the Wisconsin winters. And one of his first rules was that I handled the chores, because in his version of family, the child of a previous marriage was responsible for earning a place under the roof. So I spent my weekends scrubbing the porch boards until my knuckles stung, clearing snow from the driveway while he watched from the window, dragging heavy trash bins down the gravel path that cut through our yard, while he drank coffee and commented on anything I did wrong, and every task carried the same message that I owed him something impossible to repay, and should be grateful he tolerated me at all. He never let me forget that the land behind the house was his, the wide stretch of grass that rolled into a patch of maples and then into open acreage, the place my mother once described as peaceful, but that he renamed Legacy Lot because he said men built legacies while children only consumed them, and he made it clear that I was not allowed to set foot there without his permission, warning me that if he ever caught me exploring past the first fence line, he would make sure I regretted it. And though I did not understand its value back then, I sensed even as a girl that something about that land made him territorial in a way that edged into obsession. My mother tried to shield me when she could, speaking softly to keep the air calm, stepping between us if she sensed his temper rising, redirecting his complaints, and pretending he did not call me names when she thought I could not hear. But her fear sat just beneath her skin, thin and constant, and even if she wanted to protect me more, she never challenged him outright, choosing instead the quiet path that so many women choose when survival matters more than fairness. And I learned to do the same, keeping my voice lowered and my footsteps light, hoping he would forget I existed long enough to let me finish school and leave. Yet one evening near the end of her life, I heard something that planted a new kind of question in me, something sharp enough to cut through years of silence, because I was walking past her bedroom to the laundry room when I heard her speaking on the phone. Her voice hushed but firm in a tone I barely recognized, and she said if anything ever happens, I want Mila to have priority before Roy, the sentence floating through the half-closed door like a secret that was not meant for me, but somehow found its way into my ears, making me stop in the hallway and hold my breath. And I remember thinking, Who could she possibly be talking to that she would speak so boldly, because I had never once heard her say anything that suggested she believed I deserved more than the scraps of peace Roy allowed her to give me. I stood there waiting to hear more, but after a long pause she lowered her voice so much I could no longer make out the words, only the rhythm calm, but determined. And when she ended the call, she sat on the edge of her bed, with her head in her hands, as if a decision she had carried alone for too long had finally begun to weigh differently. And she looked older than I had ever seen her fragile, in a way that made my throat tighten. And though I stepped backward to avoid being caught eavesdropping, I kept thinking about that single sentence long after the moment passed, wondering what she had meant, wondering who she trusted enough to say it to, and wondering whether she had already begun preparing for something she never told me about. I did not understand then that she had been planning quietly and carefully to give me more than Roy believed I deserved, nor did I realize that she had been watching his behavior with a clarity she rarely showed, leaving behind threads that would later lead me through a maze he thought he had built to trap me. And in those early years, I simply tucked the memory into the same corner of myself where I hid my questions, believing that whatever she meant was something I was not old enough to grasp. Even now, when I think about those days, the constant pressure to stay small, the endless reminder that I was an outsider in my own home, I can see how the pattern began long before the night he tried to force my signature onto a deed, and how the injustice did not start with land or paperwork, but with a lifetime of being told I had no worth. Beyond what he allowed, yet buried inside that pattern, was something else. A quiet defiance born from watching my mother try to protect me in the only ways she felt safe doing, and that small spark, barely visible then, would become the force that eventually pushed me to fight for every inch he tried to take, beginning with the land he swore would never belong to me. The morning of the funeral in March of 2024 felt colder than any Wisconsin spring. I remembered a thin wind sweeping through the cemetery in Madison, as though nature itself wanted to hurry the day along, and I stood beside my mother's casket, feeling as if the ground might tilt beneath me, because grief has a way of loosening everything you thought was steady. Yet even in that fragile space, I knew Roy would not let me simply mourn, because he never missed a chance to turn a moment into a stage where he could remind everyone who he believed held the power. And he proved me right. The instant people began gathering near the folding chairs arranged in neat rows on the patch of lawn between two oak trees, the place where the pastor waited with his book, and the air smelled of wet earth and cut grass. As cousins and neighbors approached, offering polite condolences that sounded like lines from a script, Roy raised his voice in that performative way he used whenever he wanted witnesses, and he announced loudly that I had barely visited my mother in her final weeks, stretching the words so each one landed like a pebble, tossed into still water, sending ripples through the small crowd. And he added that he had been the one who cared for her day and night, painting himself as a devoted husband while casting me as the absent daughter who showed up only for the ceremony, and every time he spoke my name, people glanced at me with the same expression I had seen too many times growing up, a mixture of disappointment and judgment layered with curiosity, as though they had already accepted his version of events before I had a single chance to speak. I felt my throat tighten, not because his lies surprised me, but because it worked so effortlessly, sliding into the minds of relatives who had visited less often than I had yet, who now nodded sympathetically at him while quietly distancing themselves from me. And even though I knew better than to respond in that moment, something inside me churned with a familiar ache, the one born from years of being misunderstood while he shaped the narrative around me. The pastor cleared his throat to begin, but Roy stepped closer as if the entire service revolved around him, and while pretending to adjust the edge of the casket arrangement, he leaned down and said with a soft voice, full of warning, that I better not make him look bad tapping the toe of his shoe against my ankle with just enough pressure to make me step back, a small gesture no one else would notice, but one that carried the same message he had used my whole life. Stay quiet and stay small, and for a moment I almost obeyed out of habit, the old instinct pushing me to vanish into myself. But I forced my hands to stay still at my sides and kept my eyes forward because grief was heavy enough without letting him drag me into a familiar darkness. When the pastor began speaking about my mother's kindness and resilience, I felt a flicker of heat rise behind my ribs. Not anger at him for trying to honor her, but at the irony of hearing her strength described in front of the very man who had spent years dimming it. Yet the people around me nodded as if everything made sense, as if this arrangement of flowers and chairs and polite small talk was enough to summarize a woman who had lived in quiet fear more often than anyone realized. And as I scanned the faces in the crowd, I noticed how they softened toward Roy, the grieving husband, and hardened toward me, the daughter who they believed had failed. After the service ended, people began drifting toward the parking lot umbrellas, snapping open as the drizzle picked up, and Roy shook hands with distant relatives as though he were the host of a charity gala, instead of a widower, thanking them for their support, while telling anyone who lingered that the stress of caring for my mother had taken a toll on him. And each time someone nodded sympathetically, I felt a small fracture in my chest widen, not because I needed their approval, but because injustice hits differently when witnessed by others who accept it without question. I stayed near the casket a moment longer, wanting to whisper something to my mother, even though I knew she could not hear me. Something like "I am trying," or "I miss you," or "I hope you saw through him in the end," but the words would not form, tangled in my throat with all the things I never had the chance to say. As I turned to leave, a woman I did not recognize stepped into my path, her coat hood pulled low, her face pale against the gray sky, and for a split second I thought she might be another distant relative offering a rehearsed condolence, yet her eyes held a focus that made me straighten as if she were studying me rather than greeting me, and she leaned close enough that only I could hear her whisper that my mother had left something behind, something no one expected. I blinked, unsure whether I had misheard her, but before I could ask who she was or what she meant, she stepped back and blended into the thin crowd still scattering across the muddy grass, disappearing between umbrellas and overcoats so quickly I wondered whether she had been there at all. My heart thudded unevenly, because her tone had not been casual or sympathetic, but deliberate, like someone passing a message they were not allowed to keep. And as I scanned the area for her face, I felt that same uneasy curiosity I had felt the night I overheard my mother speaking on the phone, the sense that something important was unfolding behind the scenes of my life, something she had tried to set in motion while still alive. Roy approached again, brushing past me with a hand pressed to his forehead, as if overwhelmed with grief. But when he thought no one was watching, he muttered that I should not read too much into things today, that funerals made people say strange things, and I realized, from the way he stiffened when the stranger looked at us, that he had seen her too and recognized something he would never admit, which only deepened the knot forming at the base of my spine. Because if there was one thing I had learned living with him, it was that he feared only what he could not control. And that woman, whoever she was, had just unsettled him in a way nothing else had. As we walked toward the line of cars near the entrance gate, cold wind whipping at the hem of my coat, I replayed her words again and again, feeling them settle somewhere beneath my grief, not as comfort, but as a promise that the story Roy wanted everyone to believe was not the whole truth, and that my mother, who had always seemed too tired to fight, had left a final move waiting for me to find. In the days after the funeral, the air in Cottage Grove shifted in a way I felt before I fully understood, as though the whole town had agreed to speak a single story. And unfortunately, that story was not mine, because Roy wasted no time shaping the narrative to suit himself, spreading it with the ease of someone who had practiced manipulation for years, and by the end of the first week I could feel the shift in how people looked at me at the grocery store or the post office, their eyes lingering just long enough to tell me they had heard something and were deciding whether they believed it. I first realized how far the rumor had traveled when my Aunt Carol called, pretending to check on me, but quickly slipped into a scolding tone, asking how I could fight a man who had taken care of my mother while I chased my career in Madison, reminding me that family should come before paperwork. And when I tried to explain that I had been there more often than she ever bothered to check, she sighed heavily as if I were making excuses, then hinted that maybe I should let Roy decide what to do with the land, since he was the one who had invested his time maintaining it. I felt frustration burn low and steady in my chest, a tired heat that deepened as other relatives repeated the same sentiment, each of them using the word ungrateful in different tones. And I realized that Roy had told them I intended to steal the $820,000 of land from a grieving man who'd done nothing but love my mother, twisting the truth into something so dramatic and self-serving that no one stopped to question it. At work, the shift hit even harder because my office at Dane County Property Analytics had always been a place where I felt steady, surrounded by parcel data and property reports that made more sense than the people who filled my childhood home. Yet even there, the rumor crept in like a draft under a door, subtle at first and then unmistakable. And one afternoon, as I waited for a print job to finish, one of my coworkers casually asked whether it was true that my mother had left behind land worth nearly $1 million, phrasing it as if he were making friendly conversation, but pausing just long enough to imply judgment when he followed with a question about why my stepfather was the one handling the sale. I froze for a heartbeat because I knew exactly what Roy had told people, that he alone was responsible, and I was the irresponsible daughter trying to make trouble. And although I forced myself to respond evenly, I could feel the quiet sting of humiliation beneath my skin, the awareness that my coworkers likely saw me as someone incapable of managing her own affairs, a woman still overshadowed by a controlling father figure, even at nearly 30. The worst part was that by the end of that week, the rumor grew specific enough that someone sent an anonymous email to our office suggesting that I had ulterior motives in accessing land records, hinting that my professional role might give me an unfair advantage in the inheritance dispute. And even though the message was baseless and malicious, it was enough to make me wonder how far Roy intended to go to destroy my credibility, because he did not simply want the land. He wanted to make sure that if I ever fought him, no one would take my side. One morning, as I logged into the internal database to finish a valuation assignment, my manager, a patient man named Oliver who rarely raised his voice, asked to speak with me in the conference room. And the moment he closed the door behind us, my stomach knotted because his expression carried a seriousness I had not seen before, and he told me something that made the air shift in my lungs, something so specific and unexpected that it cut through all the noise of the rumors. He said that someone had been trying to access the appraisal history, connected to my mother's records, not through official requests, but by attempting to open restricted files at odd hours, using credentials that did not match any staff login patterns, and he explained that while no data had been altered or taken, the system had flagged the attempts because the searches were too targeted, too intentional. I felt a cold prickle crawl across my spine as I asked who it could have been, but Oliver shook his head and said the logs were unclear, that the activity appeared masked as though someone was either using a proxy or a borrowed access point, and he asked gently whether I should be concerned about anyone involved in my family's situation. For a long moment I could not speak because fear and clarity collided in my mind. Fear that Roy or someone aligned with him was digging into records he did not have permission to see, and clarity because the timing was too perfect, too connected to the whispered hints from the funeral and to the envelope and key that had fallen from the shelf that night. And I realized this was more than petty rumor spreading. It was strategic, maybe even desperate. I tried to explain the situation to Oliver without revealing too much, telling him that there was tension surrounding inherited property and that someone might be searching for leverage. But as the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of what I did not yet know press down on me. The question of why someone would need to see the appraisal history of the land my mother had insisted I stay away from as a child, and why those attempts grew bolder after her death. Leaving the meeting, my thoughts churned with the same mixture of dread and defiance that had filled me at the funeral. And while the rumor mill kept turning outside, painting me as someone trying to fight a frail, grieving man for money I supposedly did not deserve inside, I felt something else forming, something sharper than fear, as though the truth my mother had hidden was beginning to push its way to the surface, reminding me that the story Roy wanted the town to believe was only a mask, and behind it something far more deliberate waited to be uncovered. The shift from whispered rumors to open aggression came faster than I expected, almost as if Roy sensed that the story he had built around me needed a harder push to stay standing. And one quiet afternoon, while I was reviewing parcels for an agricultural valuation, my phone lit up with his name, the kind of call I had learned to dread because nothing good ever followed the sound of his voice. And when I answered, he did not bother with greetings or politeness. He simply announced that he had already arranged the sale of the land, speaking with a smug certainty that made my pulse throb in my temples. He said he had talked to a developer who was eager to move forward, and that whether I signed the deed or not did not matter, his tone dripping with the same arrogance he had used my entire life. And before I could respond, he added that he would make sure I did not see a single cent, that my name would not appear anywhere once the paperwork went through. Then he hung up as though the conversation had never required my participation. A moment later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message containing photos of a newly drafted land survey. Bright lines traced across the lot boundaries and stamped with a signature that was supposed to convince me everything was official. But the second I opened the file, I saw the tells that would be invisible to anyone outside the appraisal world: the wrong color, coding for parcel adjustments, a mismatch between the scale bar and the measurements, the faint pixelation around the notary's seal suggesting it had been pasted rather than applied. And I felt a cold clarity settle in my chest, because this was not carelessness, this was intentional. Roy had found someone sloppy enough or desperate enough to manufacture a survey for him, and he expected me to be too naive or overwhelmed to notice. But the irony was that the very job he mocked me for doing had given me the tools to see through the lie in a single glance. I wanted to confront him, but I knew better. Because Roy preferred an audience, he thrived on performance, and he wasted no time proving that by sending a group message to the extended family announcing that we all needed to meet that weekend to discuss the future of the land, making it sound like a family decision rather than a staged ambush. And by the time I arrived at my Aunt Henry's living room, the atmosphere was thick with assumptions he had planted ahead of time. Every seat was filled relatives who had barely spoken to me in years. Sitting side by side, their expressions rehearsed a blend of concern and condemnation, and Roy stood in front of them like a politician addressing supporters, thanking them for coming as if he had organized a charity event instead of a trap designed to humiliate me. He began by detailing the burden of maintaining legacy lot after my mother died, exaggerating every chore and expense, until he looked like a man forced to carry the weight of a property that was slowly ruining him. And then he shifted into a well-crafted narrative about how the developer had offered a fair price and how selling was the most responsible choice, all while painting me as the obstacle, preventing everyone from moving forward. People nodded along as though he were reciting irrefutable truths, and when he called my name, the room fell quiet in that heavy way that makes even breathing feel like an interruption. Then he held up the forged survey and said that all he needed was my signature to finalize everything, extending the packet toward me with the patronizing patience of a kindergarten teacher urging a child to follow instructions. I felt every gaze in the room pressing against my skin, some accusing, some pitying, none willing to consider that his version might be incomplete. And when I tried to speak, one of my cousins interrupted to remind me that Roy had been by my mother's side while I focused on my career. Another aunt chimed in, saying that land was complicated, and maybe I should trust the person with more experience. And someone else whispered that I was being selfish, that I was dragging the family into unnecessary conflict. The humiliation tightened around me like a belt pulled one notch too far. Not because I needed their approval, but because every instinct told me Roy had engineered the scene with precision, ensuring that the social pressure alone would be enough to force compliance. And as I looked at the faces around the room, I realized none of them cared whether the survey was real or the sale legal. They just wanted me to stop resisting so their lives could return to whatever version of normal they preferred. Roy stepped closer and placed the papers on the coffee table, tapping the top page with his finger, and saying in a low voice that if I embarrassed him in front of the family, he would make sure I regretted it. The kind of threat disguised as concern that he used whenever he thought he could corner me, and for a moment I considered walking out because staying felt like suffocating in a room filled with people who believed their assumptions more than anything I could say. But something inside me, the same quiet resolve that had been growing since the funeral, told me I did not have to fight the way he expected, that sometimes power came not from confronting, but from observing, from gathering truth in the spaces where his lies grew loudest. So I sat down and let him continue talking, let him lean into his performance, and while the family urged me to sign, I quietly opened the voice memo app on my phone and slid it face down on the cushion beside me, letting it capture every word. Roy spoke for nearly 20 minutes, listing threats, falsehoods, timelines that contradicted themselves if anyone bothered to listen closely. And when he finished, he pushed the pen toward me again, convinced he had worn me down. But instead of reaching for it, I asked a calm question about the sale date, one that made him stumble for a breath because it forced him to improvise. Then I asked another about the boundary lines and watched him fumble his explanation. And though the room remained against me, something shifted inside my own mind, a recognition that the truth was building quietly and steadily in my hands. When the meeting ended, I left without signing anything, letting their disapproval trail behind me like a second shadow. But tucked inside my coat pocket was the recording of every lie, every contradiction, every detail. Roy had been so confident no one would ever question a small digital thread that would soon become the rope he hung his entire narrative on. And as I walked to my car, in the fading afternoon light, I felt something close to certainty. For the first time in weeks, the sense that his story was beginning to unravel in ways he could no longer control. The recording from the family meeting was still sitting safely in my phone the next morning, when I woke up with that heavy tension in my chest that told me something worse was coming, something that would make the forged survey look like a childish prank. And as I brewed coffee and tried to gather myself before work, my inbox pinged with an automated alert from the joint estate account my mother had opened before her final surgery, a humble account meant only for utilities and property, upkeep never touched since her passing and protected under probate law. Yet the notification showed a large withdrawal, made the previous afternoon a withdrawal processed only 3 hours before Roy staged his grand performance in front of the family, and for a moment I just stared at the screen, feeling the blood drain from my face, because it was not just unethical, it was criminal. I clicked into the details, my fingers trembling slightly, and saw exactly what I feared. Roy had pulled several small transactions in sequence, each under the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud investigation, a tactic people use when they know what they are doing is wrong. And as the realization settled in that he had raided my mother's account, the same day he tried to force me to sign away my inheritance. Anger and disbelief tangled so tightly inside me that I had to sit down. My phone buzzed just then, and I recognized his number instantly, the kind of dread that forms a knot behind the ribs tightening as I answered, because I knew he was calling not to explain but to blame. And sure enough, His voice erupted through the speaker before I could speak, accusing me of interfering with his finances, accusing me of plotting to ruin him. And then he issued a threat so absurd and vicious that for a moment I thought I had misheard him, when he snarled that he planned to sue me for elder abuse, claiming I had manipulated my mother in her final days, twisting my loyalty into some kind of financial scheme. I let him rant until his breath grew uneven, then hung up without a word, because debating with someone who lived in his own alternate universe only fueled him, and instead I grabbed my coat and headed to the bank, knowing that I needed documentation before he rewrote the narrative again, knowing that if I waited even one day, he might bury the evidence. The bank lobby in Cottage Grove was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming softly, and when I asked for account activity, the teller glanced at me with a mixture of sympathy and caution, explaining that withdrawals made after the account holder passed were flagged but sometimes slipped through when the person doing it had access prior, and she stepped away to call a supervisor who emerged minutes later, holding a folder with printed statements. I reviewed the transactions carefully, noting the pattern, the timestamps, the signatures that did not match my mother's, and as I was highlighting discrepancies, I sensed someone approaching from the side, a gentle presence, rather than a disruptive one. And when I looked up, I froze because standing there was the same older woman from the funeral, the same woman who had whispered about something my mother left behind, her expression calm but attentive, as though she had been waiting for the right moment to reappear. She greeted me by name, which startled me because I had never introduced myself, and she asked the supervisor for a private conversation, which was granted immediately, the kind of respect that told me she was not just a passerby, but someone with authority in matters I barely understood. Inside the small conference room, she closed the door and sat across from me with a measured grace, introducing herself as Evelyn Carter, a trust officer from Madison specializing in estate preservation, someone my mother had contacted months before her passing, and hearing my mother's name spoken with such warmth made my eyes sting, despite the anger burning through me. Evelyn explained that she had been reviewing certain assets connected to my mother's affairs, and that she had recognized Roy's sudden moves as attempts to gain leverage before probate closed. But before I could ask what assets she meant, she raised a hand gently and told me that this was not the moment to reveal everything, that some truths only became useful after a person showed their full intent, and in this case, Roy had not yet exposed how far he would go. I tried to understand frustration rising because I felt like I was drowning in secrets I didn't ask for, but Evelyn leaned toward me slightly and said in a steady voice that the smartest thing I could do now was let Roy think he was winning. Let him overplay his hand, let him show the town and the law exactly what he was capable of, because once he stepped far enough across the line, there would be no defense left for him to hide behind. Her calmness unsettled me, not because I doubted her, but because she spoke as though she had already seen the end of this road, as though my mother had prepared her for this exact scenario. And when she stood to leave, she placed a card on the table with her direct number directing me to call only when Roy escalated further. I walked out of the bank with the printouts tucked inside my bag, the cold air biting against my cheeks, and as I crossed the parking lot, I understood something I had not seen clearly before, that the fight over the land was not just a desperate grab for money, it was a scramble for control from a man who knew he was losing it, and every cruel comment, every forged document, every withdrawal was part of a larger panic one that would eventually expose him for who he truly was. I sat in my car a moment longer, gripping the steering wheel as the weight of Evelyn's words circled through me, because for the first time I realized I was not fighting alone, and that Roy's downfall had already begun, even if he had not noticed it yet. And as I started the engine, I felt a quiet resolve thread through my nerves, a sense that what came next would finally break the facade he had maintained for years, the facade that had cost me my childhood, my safety, and my mother's peace. The night everything finally snapped open in front of me came only 3 days after the bank meeting, a night dense with the smell of wet pine and lingering frost, the kind of April cold Wisconsin never fully shakes off. And I remember driving home from work with Evelyn's words, replaying in my mind like a calm warning, urging patience, urging strategy, urging me not to confront Roy too early. Yet fate or cruelty, or whatever force had been steering my life since my mother died, decided that restraint was no longer on the table, and when I stepped into the dim entryway of the old house my mother loved so much, the one Roy insisted on keeping under his control until probate settled, I sensed instantly that something was wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, as if held by someone holding his breath, and before I could reach for the light switch, I felt a shadow move behind me, then a harsh grip on my arm pulling me backward, sending me stumbling into the wooden wall where my head struck the trim with a sharp thud that made white sparks burst behind my eyes, and Roy's voice erupted through the dark with a fury that felt almost feral as he shouted that I did not deserve anything my mother left, that I had cost him enough already, that he would not let a useless girl ruin his future. My ears rang, but I pushed against him, feeling the stale alcohol on his breath as he pinned me by the shoulders and shook me hard enough that my teeth clacked together, and he kept insisting that I needed to sign the deed, that I needed to stop causing problems, that I needed to remember who had raised me, because according to him, my mother owed him everything, and I owed him even more. And the words tore through me in a way that made old wounds reopen, because I had spent years balancing between fear and silence, too conditioned to withstand his anger, too worn down to fight yet now, with everything he had already done. The forged documents, the family meeting, the account theft, hearing him shout that I was nothing sparked something I had not felt in years. I twisted out of his grip and stumbled across the room, my fingers brushing against the old shelf as I tried to steady myself, and the force of my movement knocked over the small wooden box my mother kept hidden among her keepsakes, a box I had forgotten existed until it hit the floor with a hollow crack and slid toward my feet, and Roy snarled that nothing inside belonged to me, that I should not touch. What I did not understand, but I kneeled anyway because something about the box felt important in a way I could not explain. Roy lunged as if to snatch it, but I grabbed it first and pushed past him, my legs shaking as I fled down the narrow hallway, fumbling for the back door, and I burst into the cold night air with the box clutched to my chest, his shouts echoing behind me as he slammed into furniture and cursed my mother for ruining his life even after death. I ran to my car, breathless and shaking, locked the doors, and only when I pulled away from the driveway did the trembling in my hands finally overtake me, forcing me to pull over at the edge of the old field that bordered our property, the same field my mother used to walk with me when I was small, telling me stories she never wrote down, stories I suddenly wished I remembered more clearly. Under the pale wash of the moonlight, I opened the wooden box with aching care, feeling the weight of something bigger than fear settle over me, and inside I found not sentimental items, but a small silver key with an engraved symbol that looked like a stylized compass, a folded note written in my mother's handwriting, and a slim USB drive that felt unexpectedly cold against my fingers. My mother's note was brief, only one line written in her tight, precise script, telling me that if Roy ever hurt me, I should use what she left to protect myself. And beneath the line was a symbol I recognized instantly, a zoning code marker used only on certain trust-protected properties in the Midwest properties, hidden from public record, except under specific legal review, and the realization moved through me like a breath of warm air in winter, because it meant she had prepared something Roy never knew existed. I held the key up to the light, noticing faint etchings that reminded me of the internal access storage lockers used by the appraisal division for documents not included in county systems, and I felt the shock settle into a strange, quiet certainty, a feeling that the ground beneath this story was larger than simple inheritance. Finally, I plugged the USB into my laptop once I reached my apartment, my hands still shaking, and when the folder opened, I saw dozens of scanned deeds boundary maps, attorney correspondence, and something that made my breath stop, a set of trust beneficiary documents listing my name as the beneficial owner of land rights, far more extensive than the legacy lot holdings, linked across multiple counties in a way that suggested years of planning. Quiet planning, the kind my mother excelled at. It was too much to process. At once, the scale, the secrecy, the implications, and I scrolled through the files, barely breathing, understanding only fragments, but sensing the magnitude, sensing the truth that Roy had been fighting over the wrong thing all along, that the 7-figure land he thought he controlled was only a fraction of what my mother had safeguarded, and that his violent desperation came from knowing deep inside that he was losing even if he had not yet seen how badly. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the silence of my apartment swallow the chaos, and as I sat there with the wooden box beside me, I felt the dark tunnel I had been trapped in for weeks widen not into daylight yet, but into the first hint of direction, because now I had evidence leverage and the undeniable truth that my mother had trusted me enough to hide the future in my hands, a truth that made every bruise on my arm and every cruel word Roy ever spat at me feel like the beginning of his own undoing, not mine. By the next morning, the shock from what I found on the USB had settled into something sharper and steadier, a quiet line of resolve running through my spine, and as I drove toward the Dane County Property Analytics building, the sun was barely rising, casting that familiar pale Wisconsin light across the parking lot, the kind of light that made everything look colder and more honest. And for the first time in weeks, I did not feel like I was walking into my own life as an unwanted guest, but as someone who finally understood exactly what needed to be done. I took the elevator to the appraisal division, greeting the early staff with a calmness I had not felt in days, and instead of going to my cubicle, I walked straight toward the restricted records room, a place most employees never entered unless assigned a place my mother always described as the quiet vault of every land dispute in Dane County. And as I stood before the keypad access panel, I reached into my wallet and pulled out the silver ID card engraved with the association seal. The card Evelyn had noticed, the card my mother had insisted I accept during my certification training, even though I thought I was too junior to need it. The scanner beeped softly, then the lock clicked, and the heavy door opened with that familiar hum of temperature-controlled air and the faint smell of old paper and toner, a scent I had grown up with as much as the scent of our kitchen at home, because my mother spent half her life analyzing the land of other families while trying to protect her own. Inside the archive, I moved past the rows of labeled boxes and filing cabinets until I reached the non-public vault, a section only unlocked by dual authentication. And when I scanned the silver ID again, the inner door flashed green, revealing shelves of sealed envelopes and manila folders marked with red stamps, the confidential kind that existed outside the county record system until probate or disputes brought them forward. My hands shook slightly as I searched for my mother's name-scanning labels until I found a thin folder tucked behind 2 parcels, updated in 2019, its edges crisp, its tab, neatly written in her exact handwriting, and opening it felt like stepping through a doorway into the last part of her mind she never shared aloud. Inside lay the correction deed she had filed 2 years before she died. Notarized, signed, and witnessed properly reassigning boundary rights and full ownership to me, eliminating any claim Roy might fabricate, and seeing her signature beside the notary stamp made something deep inside my chest ache because she had done this quietly, carefully, likely knowing exactly what kind of man Roy was becoming, and wishing to protect me long after she could no longer speak. I copied the deed, then pulled the accompanying map records, seeing the unmistakable differences between the original parcel lines and the corrected ones she had submitted, and laying them side by side. I finally understood the magnitude of Roy's manipulation, how he had taken an old survey number and tried to resurrect it as though the corrected deed never existed, how he counted on the rest of the family being too uninformed to question him, how he assumed I lacked the backbone or the knowledge to challenge him. I printed the original deed, the corrected deed. The map overlays the survey Roy forged and the timestamp metadata, confirming the true filings, stacking them in order on the corner table. Then sat down for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the pieces fall together in my mind until the pattern formed a complete picture, a picture that revealed not only greed but desperation. When I searched the cross-referenced property logs for Roy's name, I found something I had not known: a string of delinquent loan attempts attached to his credit history, several denied applications from the past 2 years, and one shocking record showing he had attempted to use the land as collateral even though he had no legal claim. A fraudulent attempt flagged by a bank reviewer and quietly closed, which explained why he pushed so violently, why he staged the family meeting, why he forged documents, why he grabbed my wrist so hard that night and screamed about what I did and did not deserve because he was drowning financially, and the land was the only thing he saw as a lifeline. I felt a mixture of fury and clarity move through me as I copied the bank flag notice, another brick in the wall of truth that he had built against himself. And when I gathered all the documents into a single folder, I realized something simple, something profound, that I did not have to fight him with emotion or fear anymore, because facts were stronger than fists, records louder than shouts, and my mother had gifted me the one thing he never expected me to have: the ability to beat him with his own arrogance. I walked out of the archive carrying the folder against my chest, like a shield passing coworkers who smiled politely, unaware that every step I took was now guided by a map my mother had laid out years before she died. A map she trusted me to follow only when the time was right. And as I reached my car, I whispered to myself that the time had come, not just to protect the land, but to end the story Roy had written over my life, a story I no longer intended to let him control. The town hall meeting took place on a chilly Thursday evening in late April, the kind of night where the smell of damp earth mixed with old wood inside the community building. And as I stepped into the crowded room, clutching the folder of documents I had gathered earlier that morning, I felt a strange stillness inside me. Not fear and not anger, something quieter and heavier. Like the moment a storm decides to break after holding for too long. People filled every seat, some neighbors I recognized from childhood, others from the grocery store or the gas station, all murmuring with the restless energy of small-town curiosity, because Roy had spent weeks stirring excitement about a supposed land development deal that would bring money and jobs, presenting himself as the visionary behind it. And now he stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen, basking in the attention like a man convinced of his own importance. He wore his favorite brown jacket, the one he used for any event where he wanted to appear respectable, and as he paced the front with exaggerated confidence, he launched into a presentation about subdividing the land into parcels for new construction, throwing around words like economic growth and revitalization as though he had any real understanding of the process, and the crowd listened with polite interest, nodding along because most of them believed the property belonged to him, believed the lies he had repeated so often they sounded factual. I stayed seated near the back, waiting for the right moment, waiting for him to climb high enough on his own false pedestal that the fall would be undeniable. And when he pointed to the projected map showing the boundary lines, I recognized instantly as the forged survey. My heartbeat slowed, the kind of slow, steady rhythm that comes when the choice to act is no longer a choice at all, but a necessity. He ended his speech with a flourish, extending his arms as though presenting a gift. then asked if anyone had questions, clearly expecting praise, not challenge, and before any hand could rise, I pushed back my chair, the scrape of the metal legs echoing sharply across the room, turning heads one by one until every gaze followed me as I walked down the aisle toward him, my folder tucked against my side like a shield. When he saw me, his face stiffened, then twisted into something between annoyance and panic. But he pasted on a smile and said in a falsely warm voice that he was glad I came, that it was wonderful. I finally cared about family business, and the condescension in his tone was so familiar it almost numbed me, but not enough to silence me anymore. I stopped a few feet from him and spoke clearly, letting my voice carry across the room as I said he had misled everyone, that he did not have the authority to propose development on land he did not own, and the whispers rippled instantly through the room, a shift in air pressure, the collective inhale of a crowd sensing the start of something they did not expect. Roy stepped closer and hissed that I needed to sit down before I embarrassed myself again. But I opened the folder and lifted the correction deed, holding it up where everyone could see the official stamps, the notary seal my mother's signature, and the explicit line granting ownership to me alone. And the projector light reflected off the glossy page, as though highlighting it for the entire room. I said he was presenting a forged survey, that the deed he used to justify his authority had been superseded 2 years prior, and for proof I pulled out the printed maps from the archive, laying the original, the corrected, and the fake side by side on the projector table, the differences undeniable, even to an untrained eye. The room erupted instantly. People leaning forward, whispering to each other, pointing at the mismatched boundary lines, questioning how he could have overlooked something so obvious. And I felt the first wave of truth seep through the crowd, unsettling the foundation of trust he depended on. Roy lunged for the papers, but I stepped back. Then I reached into my pocket and connected my phone to the room speaker, playing the recording from the family meeting, his voice booming through the hall as he threatened me, as he admitted to arranging a sale without rights, as he belittled me in front of relatives, and insisted I sign documents he knew were fraudulent, and the room fell into a stunned silence. The kind of silence that comes only when people realize they have been watching a performance for weeks without seeing the strings. He shouted over the audio, yelling for someone to turn it off, yelling that I was twisting everything, but the recording continued until the last line played the line where he said he would make sure I regretted everything if I made him look bad. His face flushed red sweat forming at his temples, and then he snapped, losing the fragile self-control he depended on to appear respectable, screaming that I was destroying his life, calling me names he used only behind closed doors, until finally, in a burst of rage, he pointed at me and yelled that I had always been ungrateful, that he should have left me where he found me. Gasps filled the room, followed by a sharp command from one of the town officers stationed at the door, telling him to step back, and he ignored them. Stepping toward me instead, fists clenched, eyes wide as though the only way to restore his control was through intimidation. But before he could reach me, 2 officers intercepted him and held him in place, forcing him to steady himself enough to avoid being handcuffed. That was when a man in a navy suit, whom I had barely noticed sitting near the front row, stood up and introduced himself as a representative from the Regional Bank Compliance Department, his voice calm and firm, as he stated that Roy was currently under review for attempted fraudulent collateral applications involving the same property, and the shock on Roy's face was almost surreal, like the final crack in a porcelain mask. The audience erupted again this time, not with whispers, but accusations, questions, outrage, people demanding to know how long he had lied to them, how he planned to profit from a property he never owned, and the officers had to escort him out of the hall as he continued to shout that none of this was fair, that I had set him up, that I was the one destroying everything, his voice fading down the hallway like a storm, finally losing force. I stood there holding my mother's documents as the room swirled with disbelief, and for the first time in my life I felt what it meant to reclaim space in a room where I had always been dismissed to speak a truth that no one could shout over. When the officers removed Roy from the town hall, I felt the entire room shift in a way that was almost physical, as though the collective realization of his deception created a vacuum around him. And in the days that followed, that vacuum only deepened because the fallout arrived with a speed that even I did not expect, despite knowing how long he had been skating on the edge of disaster. And the first blow came less than 24 hours after the meeting, when the primary investor he had courted for months announced publicly that they were withdrawing from the proposed land development, citing concerns about legal inconsistencies and undisclosed ownership conflicts, which was their polite way of saying they wanted nothing to do with a man who had just been publicly exposed for forging documents and lying about property rights. I heard about the withdrawal from a neighbor who called me early the next morning, her voice a mixture of shock and gossip-driven curiosity, as she said everyone was talking about it at the coffee shop that Roy had been seen pacing outside the municipal office, looking frantic, waving papers, and demanding an emergency meeting. And although her tone carried the thrill of small-town drama, I could sense beneath it a subtle shift in how people viewed him, a recognition that the man they had trusted for years was never who he claimed to be. Later that afternoon, the local development board issued a statement formally removing him from the project entirely, and by evening his name had been detached from every promotional material tied to the proposal, erasing him piece by piece from the narrative he had built so aggressively, and I imagined him in his living room surrounded by the folders and sketches he once flaunted to anyone who would listen, realizing that all the doors he had forced open through intimidation were now slamming shut with no way to stop them. A few days later, he received a letter informing him that he was being suspended from the local civic association. He often bragged about leading the one where he used to sit in the front row and throw smug glances at anyone he considered beneath him, and the message cited conduct, unbecoming and potential criminal activity words that I knew would hit him harder than any physical consequence, because reputation was the currency he valued more than money. Then, neighbors who once waved at him out of habit now turned away when he approached crossing lawns to avoid conversation, pretending not to hear when he called out, and the isolation that followed him was almost palpable, as though the town itself decided to sever its ties to him, and in a place like Cottage Grove, where people remembered everything, this type of social exile carried a sting that would not fade quickly. Around the same time, civil notices began arriving at his house, one after another, each envelope marked with official stamps that made my stomach tighten. Even though they were not addressed to me, notices tied to the fraudulent documents he had submitted, claims from individuals who felt misled by him, and warnings of pending legal action that seemed to multiply with every passing week. And I learned through a friend in the county office that the state had opened an investigation into potential deed manipulation and financial misrepresentation, which meant the consequences were no longer confined to local jurisdiction, but climbing upward into more serious territory. As all of this unfolded, I remained mostly silent, choosing to step carefully, because I knew that any misstep could be used against me. Yet I could not deny the sense of validation that came with watching the very system he had tried to exploit move swiftly against him, exposing each lie the way a flood reveals every stone beneath the surface. And although I did not gloat, I did not feel pity either, because too many years of his cruelty had made that emotion impossible to summon. The true turning point came when the insurance company that had handled my mother's policy contacted the county with a report that immediately escalated the situation beyond anyone's expectations, and I learned about it through Helen, the attorney who had quietly monitored the case from a distance, and who called me late one evening saying she needed to meet the next morning because something significant had surfaced. When we sat across from each other in her office, she slid a printed document toward me, a document stamped with the logo of the Insurance Fraud Division, and she explained that during their routine verification of beneficiary paperwork, they discovered that the signature on one of the required forms did not match my mother's authenticated signatures from previous years. The difference is small enough that an untrained eye might dismiss them, but clear enough that their forensic team identified deliberate imitation. My throat tightened as she continued saying the form in question had been submitted by Roy shortly after my mother's health began declining, which meant he had attempted to alter her coverage in a way that would redirect certain payouts and benefits to him, or allow him to claim financial authority over assets that he feared she would pass to me, and the company had now referred this discovery to the State Insurance Commission for further investigation, a process that carried severe penalties, including restitution requirements, civil fines, and potential criminal charges. Hearing this made the air feel heavier, the weight of what he had tried to do, settling around me like a cold fog. And although I was not surprised, given everything I already knew, the confirmation from an official institution made the betrayal more concrete, revealing that he had been willing to cross legal thresholds long before my mother died. As the days passed, the news spread quietly among the community, and suddenly people who once believed his narratives began apologizing to me, some awkwardly, some sincerely admitting they had judged me unfairly. But even as I listened, I felt little satisfaction because their shift did not erase the humiliation I had endured, yet it did mark a change in the town's perception that allowed me to breathe a little easier with each passing day. Meanwhile, Roy grew increasingly frantic, showing up unannounced at city offices, demanding explanations, arguing with clerks, raising his voice at anyone who mentioned the investigation, and every outburst further solidified the town's belief that he had manipulated far more than property documents. By the end of the month, his once polished image had crumbled entirely, leaving him a man cornered by the truth he had spent years avoiding. And although part of me wondered how he justified his actions internally, I refused to let those thoughts distract me from what mattered, which was ensuring the legal process continued without interference. Through everything I maintained the same quiet steadiness I had learned to cultivate over decades of surviving him, and as each new consequence struck him, I felt myself reclaiming not only the land, but the dignity he had spent so long trying to strip away. I should have expected that eventually Roy would come looking for me, because men like him only become humble when every wall collapses around them. Yet when I heard the frantic knocking on my apartment door late that gray Wisconsin afternoon, I still froze for a moment, my hand hovering above the doorknob as I listened to the ragged breathing on the other side, a sound so desperate it carried through the wood as if he were trying to inhale the last scraps of dignity he still believed he had, and when I finally opened the door a few inches, he stumbled forward slightly, his eyes red and swollen, his shoulders hunched in a way that seemed impossible for the man who once strutted around town as though he owned every inch of it. He said he needed a place to stay, that he had been kicked out of the house because the bank had frozen what little remained of his accounts, that the neighbors no longer spoke to him, that even the relatives who once sang his praises refused to let him sleep on their couches, and as he spoke, his voice cracked, trembling between anger and collapse, the rhythm of a man who had never imagined that consequences could arrive at his own doorstep. He pleaded for mercy, asking me to take him in, just until he could get his bearings back, insisting that I owed him compassion, because we were family. His words slipping between gasps, as though he believed that repeating the claim enough times would rewrite the history he had built with his fists, his manipulation, and his greed. I stood still, letting him talk, letting him pour out excuses and half-apologies and rewrites of the past. And when he finally paused long enough to look at me, waiting for me to open the door wider, I simply said no, the word soft yet firm, the kind of refusal that does not rise in volume but settles like stone, and I watched the confusion flicker across his face as though he had misheard me, as though the woman he had worn down for years would never deny him anything he demanded. He repeated his request, this time angrier, accusing me of cruelty, of selfishness, saying that my mother would be ashamed of me for turning my back when he was at rock bottom. And I felt the familiar heat in my chest, the old instinct to shrink or apologize. But instead, I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, so the neighbors would not hear the conversation echoing down the hallway, and I told him quietly that he never had the right to invoke her name after everything he had done to her and to me. As if on cue, a few relatives rounded the corner of the hallway, people I barely spoke to yet who had no problem finding me when they wanted to judge, and they approached with expressions full of accusation, saying I was being cold, that Roy was still grieving, that families should help each other, even when things got difficult, their voices laced with moral superiority that evaporated the moment truth entered the room. I reached into the small leather folder I had prepared weeks earlier, the one Helen encouraged me to keep nearby just in case, and I pulled out the printed time-stamped photos taken minutes after the night Roy shoved me into the wall, the bruising around my wrist, the mark on my shoulder, and the thin red line along my neck from where his hand had pressed too hard, each image a quiet witness to what he had always denied. I held the papers out, and for the first time the hallway fell silent, the relatives blinking as though the pictures were too bright, too detailed, too impossible to ignore, and Roy stepped back instinctively, his jaw tightening the way it always did when the truth threatened to corner him. One aunt tried to mutter something about misunderstandings, but her voice trailed off as she stared at the evidence, and I could see the shift happen in real time, the realization that they had defended a man they barely understood while condemning a woman they never bothered to listen to, and the discomfort settled heavily over them until one by one they found excuses to leave, retreating down the stairs with stiff shoulders and shame flickering behind their eyes. When we were alone again, Roy sagged against the wall, wiping his face with the sleeve of his worn jacket, and for a moment he looked less like the tyrant who had controlled my childhood and more like a hollowed-out version of himself. But even in that emptiness, there was a familiar spark of manipulation, trying to climb its way back into relevance. He whispered that my mother had once tried to leave him, that she had planned to get away, but stayed because she was afraid of what he might do to me if she disappeared, and the hallway tilted slightly as my breath caught in my chest. Because although I had always suspected that my mother's silence had been shaped by fear, hearing it confirmed from his own mouth felt like a blade pressed slowly against an old bruise, making it ache in ways I was not prepared for. He said she had packed a bag once, that she had talked about seeking legal help, that she had begged him to change, and that he had threatened to take everything from both of us if she dared to walk out. And the worst part was that he confessed it, not with remorse, but with a tone that suggested he believed this revelation would somehow make me more sympathetic, as though the admission of past cruelty might buy him shelter now. My hands trembled, but my voice did not when I told him he needed to leave, that nothing he said would open my door, that he should focus on dealing with the investigations and the lawsuits waiting for him, instead of clinging to the last person he ever expected to stand up to him. And I turned away, even as he begged again, his voice cracking in a way that might have tugged at my heart years ago, but no longer carried any power over me. As I stepped back inside my apartment and locked the door behind me, I felt the weight of the entire hallway moment settle across my shoulders, a mixture of grief and liberation, and I leaned against the cool wood for a long breath, letting the silence root itself, knowing that refusing him was not just a boundary, but a final declaration that the cycle had been broken. I returned to my kitchen window and watched him from above as he walked away slowly, his figure shrinking against the fading afternoon light, and although a part of me mourned for the years lost to his presence, I did not regret the decision, because some truths could not be softened, and some doors once closed needed to remain closed forever. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that settles over a town when everyone already knows the outcome, yet still gathers to witness it. And as I walked up the steps of the Dane County Courthouse, the cool April air pressed gently against my skin, reminding me that the worst storms often end with a quiet that feels almost unreal. And when I stepped inside the courtroom, I could feel every eye shift toward me. Not with pity, but with a kind of dawning respect, a recognition that the woman they once viewed as timid had walked through fire and somehow emerged steadier than before. Roy sat at the defendant table, hunched in a way that made him look smaller than I had ever seen him. His clothes wrinkled, his eyes darting from the judge to the papers before him, as if searching for some last-minute miracle. And he kept rubbing his thumb against his index finger, the nervous gesture he always used when he wanted to intimidate someone. But today it made him look desperate, exposed, stripped of every facade he had relied on for years. When the judge entered the room, the murmurs faded instantly, the shuffle of bodies turning into the rigid stillness that only courtrooms are capable of holding. And as the proceedings began, my attorney Helen rose with a calm dignity that contrasted sharply with the jittery panic radiating off Roy, her voice steady as she laid out the documentation piece by piece, the correction deed my mother had signed, the appraisal evidence, the discrepancies in Roy's forged, surveys, the audio recordings from the family meeting where he openly tried to coerce me, each item falling like a deliberate weight into place. The judge examined everything with meticulous care, occasionally adjusting his glasses as if wanting to absorb every detail before speaking. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, the room seemed to hold its breath, a collective anticipation tightening around us like an invisible thread. He declared the correction deed fully valid, confirming my mother's legal intent, affirming that the land belonged solely to me. And with those few words, the years of doubt, fear, and manipulation cracked open into something sharp and liberating. And although I did not smile, I felt something inside me settle quietly like a heavy stone released into still water. His next statement dismantled the final vestiges of Roy's imagined authority because he ruled decisively that Roy held no legal claim to the property or any connected assets, and hearing that verdict spoken in formal language made the separation between us feel irreversible, not just emotionally, but legally, factually, permanently. The judge continued outlining the penalties for Roy's conduct, and his tone carried a gravity that made even the spectators shift in their seats as he issued a restraining order, preventing Roy from approaching my residence or any property associated with me, stating that his history of intimidation and attempts at forced signatures constituted grounds for court-mandated distance. And as he spoke, Roy's face tightened with a mixture of humiliation and fury, though neither emotion found a place to land because the authority in the room was no longer his to contest. When the judge turned to the financial penalties, Roy seemed to stop breathing entirely, his shoulders rising and falling in shallow, uneven motions, as the judge listed the restitution he owed, the fines for fraudulent filings, the mandated repayment of funds he had withdrawn illegally from my mother's account after her death, and the courtroom filled with a heavy silence as the numbers stacked one after another, each figure, a reminder that deception had a cost that no amount of bluster could erase. Helen leaned toward me, whispering that the court was following state statutes precisely, no favors, no leniency, just the straightforward application of consequences, and I nodded silently even as a part of me felt the ache of realizing how much my mother had feared reaching this point while she was still alive. When the judge asked Roy if he had the funds to repay the withdrawals, his voice cracked, barely forming the word, "No," and he admitted in a barely audible whisper that he had less than $1,000 left to his name, a statement that sent a ripple of murmurs across the room, because the man who once bragged openly about his influence and financial savvy had been reduced to near nothing, the facade dissolved until only the truth remained. The judge made a note of the declaration and said plainly that the court would begin the process of enforcing payment through liens and wage garnishment, where applicable, though it was clear to everyone that Roy had no wages left to garnish and no home left to place a lien upon because the bank had already initiated foreclosure due to the unsettled debts he had pretended for years did not exist. As the verdict wrapped up, relatives who had come expecting a more balanced outcome sat stiffly in the back row, their expressions hollow, avoiding my gaze, perhaps embarrassed that they had aligned themselves with a man whose cruelty was now documented in legal records instead of hidden in family whispers, and their silence did not comfort me. But it did confirm what I had learned over the past months, that truth, when revealed publicly, has a way of rearranging loyalties more efficiently than any argument ever could. When the judge dismissed the court, Roy rose, slowly gripping the edge of the table, as if the ground beneath him had tilted, and for a brief moment his eyes met mine across the room, not with anger this time, but with a kind of stunned emptiness, as though he had finally realized the full cost of the life he had chosen, a life built on dominance and deception that had collapsed under its own weight. I turned away before he could speak, choosing not to absorb whatever excuse or plea might have followed, because the verdict had already closed the final door between us, and as I walked out of the courtroom into the crisp afternoon light, I felt something loosen inside me with each step, an uncoiling of years spent shrinking my voice to survive him. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried a hint of early spring, the kind my mother always said meant a season of beginnings was coming. And as I stood at the top of the steps looking out over Madison, I realized that this was the first moment in a very long time in which I no longer felt the shadow of Roy's presence behind me, no longer felt the weight of proving myself to people who refused to see the truth. And although the journey had carved deep marks into my life, it had also carved open a path forward that belonged solely to me. When the legal storm finally settled and the town shifted back into its quiet rhythm, I found myself standing in my apartment surrounded by the remnants of months that had reshaped my life. And it was during one of those still mornings when the light slipped softly across my kitchen table that I remembered the final envelope tucked inside the wooden box my mother had hidden from Roy, the one I had avoided opening because I feared what it might hold, whether it would deepen the wounds or close them. And with a slow breath, I slid my finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter, written in her familiar handwriting that made my chest tighten the moment I saw it. Her words flowed gently across the page, explaining that long before her health declined, she had invested quietly in a land share project in northern Wisconsin, a venture that she discovered through a close friend and believed would someday provide stability for me. And she wrote that she placed the investment under my name through a protected trust because she suspected Roy would try to seize anything he could reach, especially if he sensed that she wanted me to have something of my own, and she apologized not for keeping the secret, but for the fear that made her hide it, saying she wished she had been stronger. Yet she hoped I would understand why she chose silence. She explained that the investment had matured significantly over the past decade, now valued at $1.4 million. And as I read that number, the breath left my lungs in a slow, trembling exhale, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant, proof that she had spent years planning for a future where I would finally be free from the man who tried so hard to break me. And I felt both gratitude and grief rise together in a way that made my hands shake slightly. She ended the letter by writing that if I ever felt lost or unsure, I should stand on the land she fought so hard to protect and remember that she believed in me long before I learned to believe in myself, and reading those words felt like her hand resting on my shoulder, again grounding me in a way I had not felt since before she passed. I folded the letter carefully, pressing its edges flat with my palm, and in the quiet that followed, I knew immediately what I wanted to do with the investment, not to erase the past, but to rebuild something meaningful from it, something that would extend beyond my own life and reach other women who moved through the same shadows I once lived in. Over the next weeks, I worked with Helen and a financial advisor to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting women escaping domestic violence, providing emergency housing assistance, legal aid, and small grants for those who needed a first step toward independence. And as we refined the mission statement, I felt a steady warmth inside me, a sense that the cycle of harm that had defined so much of my life was finally giving way to a cycle of protection and hope that would touch lives far beyond my own. The process was long and layered with paperwork, but unlike the battles of the past months, this work felt affirming, like stitching together something that had been torn open for too long. And when the announcement of the fund was published in the local paper, I received messages from survivors, advocates, and community members who thanked me for turning something painful into something powerful. Their words carrying a kind of solidarity that made me feel less alone in ways I had not expected. When everything was finalized, I drove to the Legacy lot one early morning in late May. The sky washed in soft lavender light as the sun climbed slowly above the tree line, and I parked near the familiar curve of the field where my mother once brought me to pick wildflowers, the memory warm and bittersweet as the cool breeze brushed against my face. I walked across the uneven ground, feeling the earth give slightly beneath my boots, each step grounding me, not just in the land itself, but in the history threaded through it. The history my mother protected even when she was too afraid to speak aloud, and when I reached the center of the property, I stopped letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of spring soil and distant pine, imagining her standing beside me, the way she had when I was a child, her arm looped loosely around my waist, her voice telling me that someday I would find my own place in the world. And I whispered softly that I was still learning, but I was trying, and that I hoped she was proud of the woman I had become. When I opened my eyes, the land stretched wide and steady before me, no longer a battleground, but a promise. And I felt a gentle strength rise through me as I whispered the words meant only for her, telling her that I was alive, that I was safe, that I was finally standing without fear, and the wind shifted lightly as though carrying my words forward into a space where she could hear them. As I made my way back to the car, I looked over my shoulder once more, feeling a final thread of tension unravel in my chest, and I understood then that endings did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they came softly in the quiet clarity of owning your truth and refusing to carry someone else's darkness any longer. Before driving away, I pulled out my phone, opened the Notes app, and typed the closing message for the story I planned to share with the world, not for sympathy, but for connection. A simple invitation for others to speak their truth. Because silence is where harm grows, and stories are where healing begins. And as I wrote, the question inviting anyone who had endured family injustice to share their experiences, I felt a sense of purpose deepen inside me, knowing that even one voice reaching another could shift the course of a life.